What I wanted to do is to make some remarks about how narratives shift. So there's a famous quote, which is that, how did you go bankrupt? Slowly at first and then all at once. And that's what it feels like coming back 3 years after Women's Lib 2020, which was an amazing event. And of course, then along came COVID, and here we all are 3 years later. So much has changed. And if we think about how that happened, it can feel, especially to somebody who wasn't involved along the way, I mean, I only became involved in about 2017, and of course there were people who were working much earlier. It can feel like, you know, we just had to tell people about Isla Bryson. Or we just had to say, you know, they're sterilising kids. We just had to have Kira Bell. We just had to have noticing that they keep saying her penis in media reports. But actually, there were people who've been talking about this for an awfully, awfully long time and not getting any traction. It feels like they're not getting any traction anyway. But I would argue that that was the essential lead up to us getting this traction. I was at Women and Equality's Select Committee earlier this week, and it really brought home to me how you can feel like you're making no headway, but actually what's happening is that tectonic plates are shifting, and then suddenly you feel it. And what made me think that was listening in particular to Naomi Cunningham, merrily misgendering. So Naomi, unlike the naughty girls sitting behind her, was able to maintain a professional and dignified face throughout major provocation. But more than that, she just kept saying men who think they're women, men who claim to be women. And I don't think she could have got away with that a year earlier. I think there would have been a massive hissy fit. She would have been asked to leave, or Robin Moira White would have left, or she would have been shouted down. I mean, I can't prove that, but I think that's what would have happened. So I guess she was there and able to say that because of all the people who tried to push back against the no debate, misgendering costs lives, and so on. But anyway, once she did it, and the fact was that other people who wanted to be in the room had to accept that that's what she was doing, then that speeds things up. It becomes easier for the next person. It was easier for Michael Foran, who isn't partisan in this debate in any way, for him to say, you know, Isla Bryson, I don't remember if he did say that, but he could have. And basically Robin and Charlie Faulkner, who didn't want to be sitting there listening to that, had no choice but to sit and listen to it. And they didn't combust. So the idea that misgendering makes people combust was shown to be incorrect. And you know, it was probably 20 years or so of work by a few people, 10 years by a few more people, 5 years by a lot more people, 2 years by a load of people to get us there. And I think the same thing has happened with women's jails, which is, of course, the most current issue with Isla Bryson, who's this rat rapist, who I think his real name is Adam Graham. We've been putting men into women's jails for at least 40 or 50 years globally. You may not know that, but it's been happening since the 1970s. It's been happening without them having surgery first since the 1980s. It's been happening on the basis of gender self-ID for about 10 years now. We've had rapists in women's jails before. We've had Karen White. We've had Katie Dolotovsky, this bloke they're trying to move at the moment, whose name is Tiffany something or other. He's been trying to get transferred. He was in my book. My book's 2.5 years old now. And like nobody seems to care. It feels so weird. You feel like you're surrounded by pod people in a way. Like you're saying they're putting rapists in women's jails and they're going, oh, you're transphobic. And then suddenly along comes the right story at the right moment. This feels to me as a journalist very like other stories. For example, the Libor rigging scandal, which I'm sure is absolutely front of mind to all of you. Libor is the London interbank overnight rate, and it is the rate at which banks lend money to each other in order that they can close their books and settle the global financial system overnight. And there was a big scandal during the financial crisis that it was being rigged. And this won prizes for the journalists who broke it. The thing was, everybody knew they were doing that. All the journalists knew, everybody in the entire financial sector knew, but nobody thought it was a story because everybody knew. And it was the same with the MPs' expenses scandal. Everybody knew that that's how MPs made a bit of extra money. You were told to do it. You were advised to do it when you became an MP. Other MPs told you. It wasn't a story until it was. And so what we've seen, after that very lengthy preamble, is that all of the people here, and all the journalists who've worked on this, all the parents who've talked to schools, all the people who've said in healthcare provision, etc., that this isn't okay, all of that patient work has made us arrive at a point where it wasn't a story and now it is. And so that's great work from everybody, and I hope it gives everybody heart to keep going, because now the hard work starts, to use that cliche. Because now we actually have to get them to roll back. Now they can't say it's not a story. Now they can't say parents don't care. Now the journalists are starting to get in touch and say, how can I push back on preferred pronouns? And we have to keep going, because it won't be enough unless we roll back the laws, policies, practices that have come in while we were able to say, this isn't a story, nobody cares. And so that's what I would try and advise everybody here to do, to think about how you can engage, how you can go out into the world and challenge data collection, or how you can write to the BBC and say, but why did you call J.K. Rowling a bigot? And keep going on these things that engage people at a policy level. So I know that sounds boring compared with, feeling like we've made all the difference by changing the narrative, but changing the narrative is just the start of doing the hard work, of getting back our laws and our practices and our policies. I would advise focusing on the most boring things, the data collection, the risk assessment, the systems for things like safeguarding. And the reason for doing that is twofold. One is often those things are written down in very clear-cut language, so it's hard to say, well, it's case by case, or we have to think about being inclusive and using new language. Basically they've got MRF on a form, or there's a flow chart for the procedure they have to go through. Everywhere that people sign off on policies, everywhere that they might risk getting into court if they get that policy wrong. And the other reason for focusing on those things, I think this is because I've got 3 microphones that I'm suddenly humming. It's that one. All right. Everywhere that people have to sign off on policies, you can talk about these things. But the second reason is that if you focus on some written down policy, or demanding to see the written down policy, or asking why they didn't follow the policy, it's harder to call you transphobic. So if you say to somebody, why don't you care about women's rights too? Why don't you think about the way that people have gender critical beliefs? Well, all well and good, but you are now marked. And we all know that. We all know they'll be watching you to trip up now. But if you go to them and you say, Pupil Regulations England 2006 59.2 says that there's a standard form for writing down data when you register a child at school, and that's the format that it has to be transferred to every other school, very hard for them to call you transphobic. And also rather hard for them not to do it, because that's actually a statutory regulation. So, after changing our narrative, I'm asking you to get boring and start engaging on policies. I asked Naomi, because she's the woman of the hour, what she would say to anybody who's asking to challenge these things in the workplace. Because as Naomi, like every employment lawyer always says, it's better to have a job than to have a good HR case. Maya is 3 years and counting on hers, and it's no fun, let me tell you, watching her. I meant it's no fun. I can tell that it was no fun for her by watching her. I'm enjoying it all very much. And Naomi said that her hints were, push back wherever you see the word gender replacing sex. Ask for the protected characteristic of gender reassignment to be defined correctly and not elided with gender identity. Check whether men are being allowed to self-identify into the women's loos, because in the workplace you've got employment regulations, building regulations, and one that refers to landlords only in your favour, and they're very, very clear-cut. And then write a calm, helpful message saying, I think you should know that this isn't quite accurate. Channel Naomi's beautiful politeness. Message to HR and ask for a meeting. Look at your diversity monitoring form and ask, is your employer collecting sex data? If it's not, are they worried about signalling in their policies that they don't much care about discrimination on the grounds of sex? And whenever you see them doing any corporate virtue signalling or flag waving, ask them about reputational risk and neutrality. And maybe use mermaids as a cautionary tale. And then finally, if you're feeling brave, opt politely out of pronoun rituals. So nothing she says is risk-free entirely, but if poking your head above the parapet is going to make somebody powerful hate you, they can make your life a misery. So look for allies, be super reasonable, and to repeat her most important point, a job is better than a tribunal claim, no matter how good that tribunal claim is. Go forth and be boring, my friends.